Good morning, everybody. I want to thank you all for joining us today to welcome you to our webinar on how to keep your information safe and secure. My name is Belinda, and I am the Director of Treasury and Governance for Payworks. And joining me today is Kevin Sokolowski.
Hello, everyone.
And Kevin is the Chief Information Officer for Payworks. We appreciate everybody being here, and we hope that the webinar is going to give you some really good insights and some takeaways that you can take back to your organization. There we are. Our focus today is going to be on governance, information security, and the important roles these things play in small business operations. As we know, the development and improvement of modern technology is evolving at the speed of light. Unfortunately, so is the sophistication of hackers and their tactics for accessing sensitive and important data. So before we get into that, we're just going to do a few housekeeping items, and then we'll get started. So first off, if you have any questions, can you send them to us through the webinar using the question feature? We'll try to answer as many as possible at the end. We've saved some time, about 10 or 15 minutes. So if you want to wait until the end there, that would be great. And then there's also a version of the webinar available in the handout section on the right-hand side so that you can refer back to the presentation later if you want. So with that, we are going to start our presentation. We're broken out into two separate areas here, two parts, and we're going to first start talking about governance and its role in your business. And then following that, Kevin is going to talk through information security, the myths, the facts, and some of the ways that you can stay vigilant against potential security breaches. Along the way, we're going to provide some real-world examples to help sort of inform our discussions or form some context around our discussions. What is governance? Governance can be pretty complex. A lot of people think that it's hard to understand, hard to come up with a really simple definition. That's because the need for governance is so broad, and the actual meaning of the concept depends on the degree of formality imposed in the internal rules of a particular organization. Many people think that only public or large companies, established companies with lots of shareholders need to be concerned about governance, or that only those large ones can benefit from it. But the reality is that all companies, big and small, private and public, early stage or well-established, all compete in an environment where good governance is a business imperative. One size doesn't fit all, but the right size governance practices will positively impact the performance and the long-term viability of every company. For today, we're going to proceed with the definition laid out by Wikipedia, and that is that governance is the way rules, norms, and actions are produced, sustained, regulated, and held accountable. In other words, governance is doing the right thing and communicating it clearly throughout your business. Small business can have a huge variety of rules and regulations, depending on the industry that they operate in, and sometimes even who their clients are. Businesses dealing with foreign government contracts will have different requirements than the oil industry, who are going to have different requirements than the food industry. And some policies will need to be considered regardless of the industry. Things like privacy policies, and one thing that's common right now, one thing that's a big topic, is drug use in the workplace. And of course, one of the most common processes faced by almost all small businesses is payroll. So how common is payroll? According to the Canadian Payroll Association, in 2018, 1.47 million employers were small businesses, 98% of Canadian employers, and they're paying $929 billion in wages and benefits, $310 billion in stat remittances, and $310 billion and $180 billion in retirement and healthcare benefits. So given how common it is and how relevant it is, we're going to use payroll as our governance example. So when you're talking about payroll and governance, there are four main pillars really to think about. And those four pillars are people, processes, compliance, and technology. You're looking at governance when it comes to the people segment. The roles and responsibilities and accountabilities of the payroll team are some things that you want to look at. You want to consider that your payroll people have appropriate skills, qualifications, and training, as well as making sure that anybody else involved in the process is adequately trained, including things like all of the backup staff. And you want to make sure that there's access to ongoing training and education, and think about how these people are going to stay current, making sure that they stay up with legislative changes and the latest payroll fraud schemes, things like that. Well, that's what the people factor in good payroll governance. We're also going to talk a little bit about the processes. Good processes, good governance around payroll processes are understanding and documenting the end-to-end processes. This goes right from the employee setup, logging the hours, right through the bank reconciliation and your year-end processes. You want to make sure that you've identified any gaps in the controls. You want to make sure that you're actually monitoring and reviewing your controls so that when you have identified a certain process, you've got all of your controls documented. You want to make sure that they stay relevant. If you're still doing the same thing 5 years later and it really isn't adding any value, then you want to make sure that you've gone back and fixed that, brought it back up to date. The other part of the process is segregation of duties. So if you've got one person's actually paying out the hours and that same person is reconciling the bank account, there's potential there for some risk. So you want to make sure that you've got enough people in the process so that things are being sort of done independently. And then, of course, the other part of the process is the data management. Where is your data? Where is it being transferred from and to? Do you have any third parties involved in the process? Are you transferring any information to third parties? If you are, what is their privacy and security practices? So those types of things you want to understand as well. And then finally, general technology controls over payroll systems and supporting tools. So you want to make sure that you understand who's got access to the system, make sure that it's current, make sure that when employees are moving on or going on to different jobs that they're losing the access to the payroll system if they shouldn't have it anymore. And you want to make sure that you've got a very clear understanding as to what your automated controls are and what your manual controls are. This includes the exchange of data, again, between payroll and finance systems, third-party processing, and reporting. When we look at payroll, again, still looking at payroll, comes with its own set of risks. So for most businesses, as we said, payroll is one of the most important processes. One of the biggest challenges for small and medium-sized businesses is tracking and managing cash flow. And for many, payroll has the biggest impact on cash flow. So it's key that we all know it's key that payroll is done right the first time, and it's done on time, and it's done securely. But it's more than just that. It comes with its own set of risks as well. We've got compliance exposures, information breaches, and fraud. So if payroll did go wrong, and there were some compliance issues or some information breaches or fraud, these are some of the things that could happen to your organization, the impacts to your organization if it goes sort of off the rails. So we've got damage to your reputation, right? If you've got a privacy breach and your employees' information is out there and it hits the press, then there's problems there. Nobody's comfortable with your employee information floating around out there. There's financial impacts, either through fraudulent activity or through lawsuits and fines and penalties imposed by CRA or others. There's cost of credit protection for your employees if their information gets out there. You've got employees, potentially got employees quitting or trouble recruiting good employees in the future. So these are all some of the issues that you might need to contend with if in fact something does go wrong with your payroll and you've got either the compliance exposures, information breaches, or fraud. We're going to talk a little bit more about those three. When it comes to compliance breaches, compliance exposures, payroll people have to deal with over 200 provincial and federal regulations. Excuse me. They've got, there's provincial and federal regulations. And usually when there's a compliance issue, it's because there's a lack of knowledge. So it's not normally an intentional act. It's not something that somebody goes to sort of set something up for. It's 9 times out of 10, it's simply because people don't understand what the regulations are. So they're not complying because they don't understand. Some of the implications, like I said, were fines and penalties. The owners or directors can be sued. Bank accounts can be frozen. You can be faced with lawsuits, encounter difficulty hiring, or worst case, issues could be so large that they could in fact lead to the close of the business. So the mitigation strategies to get around the compliance issues or compliance exposures is to make sure that whoever is doing payroll has access to the latest training and updates, and make sure they're following legislative requirements and implementing changes when necessary. And the next piece we've got there is information breaches. So Kevin's going to talk a little bit more about the technology side, but he's going to share some tips and tricks as well and some mitigation strategies. But when it comes to payroll data, one of the most important things to keep in mind is that it's valuable. People buy it and sell it all the time. SIN numbers, bank account data, it all gets exchanged at an alarming rate. So information breaches can be accidental or intentional. They can come from inside your business or from outside. Verizon releases a report every year, and in 2018, their report tells us some of the stats that you might find surprising. 15% of information breaches involve the food, accommodation, and food services industry. 73% are perpetrated by outsiders, and 58% of information breaches are from small businesses. So it's not something that only the large corporates need to worry about, and it's not something that only big international businesses are getting targeted for. All the little guys are getting targeted as well. So it's over half, 58% of them. So information breaches are something that we really need to take seriously. And then finally, we've got fraud. Fraud can be internal or external, but it's never accidental. It's always an intentional act. Most common types of payroll fraud is the ghost employees. So this is when a fake employee is set up on payroll, or a terminated employee is reactivated with new banking information, things like that. Buddy punching, which is an employee showing up late for their shift or not showing up at all, but their buddy is punching in for them or recording their hours. Pay rate alteration is someone giving themselves a raise, and unauthorized hours. So putting in the wrong hours, charging for overtime that's never actually been worked. These are internal, and they can and generally do go on for years before they're ever detected. Some of the best mitigation strategies here are secondary reviews, really good audit trails, and segregation of duties. So again, that's somebody that isn't doing payroll is one that's actually balancing the bank account, or someone that doesn't someone that doesn't do payroll opens the mail. So that way, if CRA notices get sent saying that your remittance money hasn't been received, it's actually somebody else besides the payroll person that's getting the notice on those. That's actually been a fairly common fraud in the U.S. And the other side, we've got the external fraud. Sorry. External fraud. So one of the very common ones going on right now is similar to the CEO fraud. So the CEO fraud emails are, and again, Kevin will speak more to spoofing here, or spoofing or phishing, a little bit of both, depending on how they do it. But the CEO fraud is an email that goes out to an employee and says, hey, you know, I'm Joe, the president, and I'm out of the office right now, but I really need you to send some money somewhere. And so accounts payable departments across Canada and the US have been responding to these and making payments because they think that it's coming from a legitimate person. We've also got one that's sort of spoofed off of that or spawned off of that is an email that's going around right now saying, hey, this is you know, I'm the director of HR or whoever, and here's my banking information because I changed my bank account. So can you please go into payroll and change it? So of course the payroll person is following up and doing exactly that because they think they've got a legitimate email. They're changing their direct deposit information, and no one knows that this has happened, that this spoof has happened until payday comes and goes and the director of HR hasn't been paid. So that's a huge thing that's going on right now, both in Canada and the US. It's happening whether you do payroll yourself or whether you outsource payroll. So that's something to be super aware of is if there's emails coming in, if your payroll people accept emails from people saying, here's my new banking information, make sure they're validating that. The best way to mitigate it really is to pick up the phone and call that person. Say, hey, got an email from you, change your banking, was it really you? We've been talking to our bank and there's quite a bit of a pickup on this. So it's, the fraudsters are rather successful with this scam. So everybody needs to sort of be super diligent. And again, that goes back to training and education. Your payroll people, in this case, needs to have the right training and education, needs to stay current on what's going on in the industry. And of course, there's the CRA one that's been going around. CRA funds money because they say that you've been late on your taxes and late on your GST remittances and PST remittances, and in fact, it's all just a scam. So again, just need to have some diligence there. You need to understand who's involved in the process inside your organization so that they can be aware and hopefully educated so that they're not falling for those. And here we go. So governance. So the important questions really, now that we've been through our payroll example, put up some important questions here to think about. Hopefully you can see why good governance is important. The act of documenting the end-to-end process helps highlight where some of your exposures might be, while the act of communicating your business policies gives you a better position to act on any irregularities. Once policies are written and shared, a review process should also be in place to make sure that they stay current and make sure that they stay relevant. So this is just one example as to how good governance would apply in your organization. This is, like I said, this is the payroll example that we use. And it doesn't, one size does not fit all. Right-sized governance practices will positively impact the performance and long-term viability of every company, but you need to do what works for you. A larger business, a larger still small business would have different governance practices than a 1 or 2 employee organization. So that is the end of our governance section. So I'm going to hand it over to Kevin now, and he's going to take us through some information security stuff.
Good afternoon, everyone. That was riveting. Thank you, Belinda. We're going to move on to information security now. And basically, the first thing we need to do in order to understand information security is to define it. So information security is made up of 3 distinct pillars. There is confidentiality, which is, does the person have access to information and is it restricted to what they need to do in order to do their job? So it's the restriction of access to information. Integrity of the data, is the information correct and immune to accidental or intentional unlogged changes? So basically, is the data safe and secure? And the availability of the data. Is it accessible when users need access to it in order to perform their jobs? So those three pillars are what make up information security, and that'll be kind of our guiding light for the rest of the presentation. So if we talk about the types of people who attack organizations, there's kind of three major groups of them. There is the activists. They're disruptive. They're focused on bringing attention to themselves or a cause in particular. So they're looking to deface corporate websites or embarrass organizations. So groups like Anonymous and things like that would fall into the kind of the activist group. They don't use super sophisticated techniques. They kind of just shotgun their attacks out there and hope that they catch somebody. There's the criminal organization. So these folks are in it for the money. They're in it and they treat it like a business. They invest quite a bit of money into researching new techniques. They'll use a high degree of sophistication, and they have basically a research and development arm that's responsible for churning out new vulnerabilities or new attack vectors on their behalf in order to generate revenue. And then there's the spies. So the spies are the nation-state sponsored hackers. These are the most persistent. They're the most sophisticated. They have budgets in the billions of dollars. So countries like North Korea and Iran, they use their nation-state spies to generate revenue for their economy, especially in the economies that are being sanctioned by the United Nations. They use hacking as a method to get around those sanctions, generate revenue for their economy. There's also nation-states like China that are looking to exfiltrate state secrets from countries like the US or Canada in order to build replicated technology and sell it on the global market. If we look at the types of tactics that these folks use, we'll see that 87% of all the breaches in 2017, according to the Verizon Data Breach Investigation Report, 87% were due to weak or stolen credentials. Stolen credentials are obviously the #1 target because they're easily bought on the black market. There was a recent release in January of collection #1, which contained over 700 million combinations of email addresses and passwords that were collected from data breaches throughout the years. So that's kind of like the #1 target for people to be stealing those credentials and trying to stuff them into different services. Then there's the hacking. So this is the actual technological breakdown of barriers. So trying to bypass firewalls and infiltrate networks through technology at 62%. Malware, which we'll talk about in a little while. So things like CryptoLocker and things of that nature at 51%. Social engineering, and that includes phishing and the CEO fraud email that Belinda had mentioned, techniques like that. We're seeing this on the rise quite substantially over the past couple of years. Part of the reason for that is it's a very low risk activity for the bad guys. Generally, if a social engineering campaign fails, nobody really reports it. There's not a ton of trace left behind as to who did it. And they really only need a handful of successful targets in order to make some money. And then the physical threats, those are the actual physical break-ins of facilities. So if somebody breaks into your office and steals a bunch of laptops, there may be data on those laptops that is valuable to the bad guys. And astute mathematicians in the group may notice that this doesn't add up to 100%. It's quite a bit higher. And that's because generally the bad guys will try and stack different attack methods. So they won't just use one or the other. They'll stack them up generally with social engineering along with malware, which will lead to hacking. So that's why your percentage there won't add up to 100%. So if we go into a little bit more detail about weak or stolen credentials, there's a few things that are fairly straightforward that most people have probably been told over the years, but it doesn't hurt to revisit. Some tips for good password hygiene would be don't use passwords that are based on personal information or that can be easily guessed. So if you have a Facebook account, don't base your password on information that's publicly visible on your Facebook account or your LinkedIn account. That's generally bad practice because it's easy enough for us to guess that. Don't use words that can be found in a dictionary. So if you use a single word that's found in a dictionary, it's relatively easy for computers to be able to crack those. Using a special combination of letters, numbers, and special characters. This one's a bit controversial because for security practitioners, we find that this becomes a bit of a problem for users in remembering their passwords. So adding a bunch of special characters and numbers to random text, it's easy for computers to crack those, but it's hard for users to remember. So that's kind of an outdated method of keeping your password secure, but is generally the best practice that's recommended if you go and do the research on the internet. That's what everybody's going to tell you to do. The next point, using passphrases, this is where the value of using long, complex phrases of words comes in handy, because the longer your password is, the harder it is going to be for a computer to crack it. And if you use a passphrase, it's going to use plain text words that are easy for you to remember. So you're basically making it hard for computers to figure out what your password is, and you're making it something that's easy for you to remember. Try not to save your password anywhere. I know it's convenient. If you log into Facebook or Google and you want them to remember your login so you don't have to log in each time, it's very tempting to do that, but we recommend that you actually have to enter your credentials each time you access online services. And if there's one takeaway from this slide that you remember, it is the bottom point. Not reusing your password on different systems and services is probably going to be your #1 protection against a larger data breach in case one of your accounts is compromised. So if we look at the collection #1, where we have our 700 million plus email password combinations, these were breaches that have been collected over the years. And if you're reusing a password that's included in that list, chances are the bad guys are going to start trying to attack other systems that they think you might have access to. So if you're using your corporate email address for your LinkedIn account and they see that your password is password123, they're going to try that all over the place. So they're going to try log into your Facebook account. They're going to try log into your corporate network. So not reusing that password on different systems is going to protect you from breaches like that. And if we look at the top 10 most stolen passwords on the internet, hopefully everybody in the audience can agree these are terrible passwords and no one should ever use them. They're still in circulation and still in use. So obviously it's not, the message isn't getting through to folks that protecting your password and using good password hygiene is critical to protecting yourself online. And the most common passwords in a corporate setting, password #1. And like I had mentioned before, having the combination of capitals, a number, and a symbol gives you a false sense of security. Well, it's going to be really easy for a password cracker to get through this particular password very quickly. So I understand that the direction for the past decade has been to include the numbers, capitals, and symbols. However, combining those with a passphrase is going to be your best protection. So we'll go through creating a strong password here. So #1, use a phrase. Tall, dark, and handsome. You guys can't see me, so that's me. Add capital letters to your phrase. So now you've got and still an easy to remember password. You're capitalizing the nouns, and then adding symbols and numbers to that to come out with some substitution for the letters and numbers. That way it is a passphrase. It's going to be difficult for a password cracker to get through this, and it's also going to pass your corporate password requirements of having the numbers and symbols involved. Now, as we move on to hacking, so this is the technological method that bad guys are going to use to break down your technological defenses and gain access to your network. So hackers generally use a handful of tools. They're readily available on the internet. They're not not particularly hard to get your hands on. One of the key things is using a vulnerability scanner, which will go through your network and look for machines that are not patched or vulnerable to exploit. Port scanners are there to find what services are available over the internet from your organization. So whether you have a web server or an email server or an FTP server, that will expose those services to a potential bad guy. Like I had mentioned, the password crackers, those are responsible for actually brute force attacking your passwords. Packet sniffer is there to actually eavesdrop on network traffic. So one of the ways to mitigate that is to make sure that you're only connecting via encrypted channels to external websites. Those packet sniffers can't actually get into that encrypted data. Spoofing attacks, like Belinda mentioned, pretending to be another organization or another piece of software. And then rootkits are basically ways of accessing your system as if it were in an administration mode. So to mitigate these attacks, I mean, it's pretty common sense stuff, is making sure that you have a software firewall installed on your workstation, make sure it's up to date, having reputable antivirus software on your system and making sure that's up to date. Changing your passwords at least 90-day interval is extremely helpful, and making sure that you're monitoring what's going on with your system. So if you notice that it was working fine one day and the next day it's slowing down and feeling kind of weird, it might be a good time to contact somebody that, that does the IT for your organization, just to have it checked out, just to make sure that nothing bad has been installed on there. So some of the ways that we can be aware of hackers, the number one thing that we focus on at Payworks is employee awareness training. So from this slide, if your number one takeaway is making sure that your employees are aware of the risks that are out there, that is so incredibly critical, because the other four of the points are kind of useless if your employees just let the bad guys in the front door through an email or clicking on a link that they're not supposed to. So having your employees being aware of risks, we're not trying to make them out to be security experts or computer nerds or anything like that, but we want to make sure that they understand that there are bad guys out there and they are targeting small businesses just as much as they're targeting larger organizations. In fact, there's a case to be made that the bad guys are going to be focusing their efforts more on small business, just due to the fact that there's going to be less technological sophistication potentially to a small business than there will be in a large enterprise. Number two, having your anti-malware software installed and updated, avoiding logging into insecure sites, so sites that don't start with HTTPS, make sure you don't enter credentials into there. Never use email to transmit personal information. Just in general, unverified sources is even worse, but email traffic isn't encrypted generally. So sending personal information or credit card details or banking information through regular email is generally not the best practice, and any bad guy can listen in on that traffic and potentially steal that information. And number five is only downloading apps and products from verified sources. Be wary of what you're installing on your devices, whether it's your workstation at work or your cell phone. Verifying the permissions and things like that it's requesting makes sense for the type of application that you're installing. I'm going to talk a little bit about malware. So what is malware? It's short for malicious software. It includes a family of kind of four major groups. One is a computer virus, which tries to spread itself through technological means, through emails. So basically, if you access an executable that's infected, what it'll try to do is send itself out through email to your contacts. It may install other families of malware as well. So one of them would be a Trojan, which sits there dormant and allows access through the back door of your system to gain access to files and data and things like that on your computer. The computer worm, which will actually try and work itself through your local network without any action taken beyond that. So if you open a malicious attachment, the computer worm will try and infect files on your network without any other users having to do anything. So one of the ways to mitigate that would be to have restricted access to network resources. So making sure that you only have access to information on the network that you need in order to do your job, to protect files on the network that might not belong to you. And then the last family would be the keylogger family. So this is software, or it can actually be physical devices that are installed on your machine that basically logs all the keystrokes that you make on your computer. So if you're logging into your banking website, it'll log those keystrokes and fire those off to the bad guys so that they can log into your bank account at a later time. So generally, these are either used as a singular item, or they're combined together in order to attack your network. There's also a special family of malicious software, and it's basically fake antivirus software. So as you're browsing around the internet, you may come up with a pop-up saying that your system has been infected and you need to click here in order to clear the infection from your machine. Generally, the 99.9% of the time, this is malicious software, and it's trying to mimic legitimate security software. It's generally not there to steal information. It's there to be a nuisance for the most part. It's extremely difficult to remove for your IT folks or for yourself, and it's spread through all kinds of different means. So, you know, from ad networks on Google, there can be a malicious ad. So you could be visiting websites that you normally visit on a regular basis, and all of a sudden this will pop up, and that's because a malicious ad has gotten into the ad network. And you know, don't panic if you're prompted while you're surfing the web saying that you've been infected. It's similar to CRA calling and saying that there's an arrest warrant out for you because you owe back taxes. Those are reasonably safe to ignore. They're not going to phone you to tell you that. They'll send you registered mail. Similar with your antivirus software. If you've already got antivirus on your machine, chances are it's not going to miss the hundreds of infections that these software purport that you have on your machine. And like I mentioned, the keyloggers, they monitor your keystrokes and allow access to other sites. Some of them are very sophisticated and will only activate when you visit targeted websites. So a lot of them are set up to turn themselves on when you access banking websites, so that they can avoid detection from your antivirus software because they're laying dormant until something of value pops up that they might be interested in. There's also the inverse of the keylogger, which is known as a rubber ducky. So basically, these are USB devices that get plugged into your machine, and they actually send commands through your computer to applications on your machine. So basically what will happen is these devices will wait until you log into your banking information site, and these can be programmed in order to submit commands to transfer money to another account without you knowing. So there's kind of two attack vectors there via USB. One is a physical keylogger, and one is a rubber ducky that can inject keystrokes into your workflow without you noticing. So some prevention tips. Again, this should be relatively, none of this should be relatively new to anyone. So prevent yourself from being infected. Don't follow links in unsolicited email messages. That's good practice, is when you get something that you're not expecting, is to treat it as if it is something bad. Ensure that your antivirus software is always up to date. There are new viruses coming out every single hour. So ensuring that your antivirus software is up to date is going to ensure that you're protected at all times. Backing up your data is extremely important. Ideally, it'll be an offline backup, so that if you're infected by a crypto locker scenario where your data is encrypted and the attackers are demanding Bitcoin in order to restore your data, having that backup can avoid the awkward situation of having to purchase Bitcoin and send it to some stranger in Romania and hoping that they're going to give you the keys to your data back. Being aware of the email scams and some of the techniques used in social engineering, which we'll talk about shortly. Making sure your operating system is always up to date. Operating systems are very large pieces of software, and they have obviously vulnerabilities and bugs in the software. The vendors do a great job of making sure they're patching them, but you have to actually make sure that you're keeping up with them on a regularly scheduled window. So Microsoft will generally do Patch Tuesdays, where they'll release security patches every single week. I would encourage everyone to check on Tuesday evenings to make sure that their systems are up to date if it's not set up to automatically do so. And just using caution when opening email attachments. Many email clients will allow you to preview the contents of an attachment in the actual email application itself. I would recommend turning that feature off, as if there are malicious bits of code in those attachments, previewing them can actually fire off those malicious pieces of code and expose you to potential shenanigans. Next up is social engineering. So there are basically 4 categories of social engineering and 4 techniques that the bad guys will use in order to try and get access to your information. So social engineering is it's basically hacking people. So hackers will try and break down technological defenses. Social engineers will try and exploit people's vulnerabilities. And they'll do so in one of 4 ways. One, through intimidation, which is basically trying to bully you and prey on your desire to avoid confrontation. So they'll pretend to be an angry customer or an angry manager and trying to bully you into giving access to information that you might otherwise give them. Helpfulness, they're going to try and take advantage of your instinct to help. So they'll come up with a sob story that'll make you sympathetic to their need to access whatever information that they're asking for, and try and prey on your desire to be helpful to somebody. They'll use familiarity, so they'll pretend to be a service person, or they'll pretend to be a job interview candidate. Generally, this type of stuff is done in person to try and gain physical access to the facility. Not super common, but it does happen. And then the technical side of things, they'll send emails or make phone calls pretending to be your IT company, saying that they need you to validate your credentials or things like that, hoping that you'll send them over email, and then they'll have access to your credentials. So these are kind of like the 4 main subgroups of social engineering attacks. So some examples of social engineering. So they'll make contact, generally in large scale attacks. They'll do it through email because that's the easiest channel into a facility, but they'll do it via phone as well. They'll try to do it through Facebook Messenger or through LinkedIn or things of that nature, or they'll actually do it face-to-face. It's not super common, but it does happen. So they'll show up and pretend to be a maintenance guy or a delivery guy or whatever, hoping somebody will let them into the building. And then they can start snagging physical files or computers or things like that. Generally, that's a little bit more of a high-risk activity for the bad guys, so they're not super keen on exposing themselves in that manner. But if there's a high-value target, then for sure that's something that'll happen. One of the things they might do, though, is they don't even need access inside the facility. They may just drop infected USB keys in your parking lot. A classic example of this was the United States of America and Israel hacked Iran's nuclear facilities a few years back, and they did exactly that. They just dropped infected USB keys in the parking lot, and one of the workers at one of the facilities plugged that USB key into their machine, and it was a highly targeted, expertly crafted piece of malware that actually shut down their nuclear reactors, and they had weeks, if not months, of recovery effort just because somebody plugged in a USB key. And the bad guys will actually sift through your garbage. They'll look for information, emails that have been printed out, personnel files that have been thrown in the garbage and not shredded. I've physically seen people do this. I've physically done this myself back in my younger days of actually going through dumpsters, looking for useful information that would get us free internet back when I was a kid. So it does happen. It's dirty work, but people will do it if there's enough value there. So how do you protect yourself from things like this? Well, obviously shredding your documents before disposing of them is pretty important. That way, if you're not sure if something needs to be shredded, chances are it needs to be shredded. Having too much stuff in the shredder is way better than putting something that's potentially sensitive information in the garbage unprotected. Having an employee training and response plan for people who are in the building without name tags or without visitor passes, training them to, they don't have to tackle bad guys in the office, but if they see somebody without proper credentials or without a badge, just ask those people if they can help them. And generally, if somebody is trying to stealthily get into your facility, just having an employee asking them if they need help will be enough to kind of get them unnerved and get them out of your building. Trusting your gut. People are really good at understanding when something doesn't feel right. If it doesn't feel right, assume that it isn't right and work back from there. And also don't disclose personal or company information on social media. That type of information can be used by social engineers in order to gain access, understand your organization structure or things like that, in order to perpetrate attacks on your organization, either in person or through email. An extension of social engineering is phishing. So phishing is kind of a wide-ranging catch-all for email attacks. Generally, these types of scams are pretty wide-ranged, from shotgun attacks where they try and get you to click on a link to download a virus, or very targeted attacks like Belinda had mentioned as far as CEO fraud. So these types of attacks are going to be highly targeted, ask you for information to be sent to a pretend CEO or a pretend president or manager, things of that nature. And obviously, if from the chart here, the targets are generally ones where the money are. So payment services and financial services companies are ones that are hit most often because that's where the money is. So how do we recognize a phishing email? It used to be pretty straightforward, where it was broken English, not very well crafted, and Nigerian princes needing to send you $2 billion. The attackers today have become a little bit more sophisticated in their attacks. In this example, there's an email from myself at AwesomeCo asking my payroll supervisor for information for a surprise CRA audit. The bad guys will actually go and register domain names like this. So if you look at the email address for myself, instead of AwesomeCo with a W, there are 2 V's stacked together. So somebody that's in a hurry would probably skip over that and potentially respond. So the best way to mitigate these types of emails, like Belinda had mentioned, is verifying from the source, not through replying to the email, obviously, but picking up the phone and phoning the owner of AwesomeCo and saying, did you actually send this? I think everybody would appreciate verifying as opposed to being irritated that they're being bothered. And again, avoiding phishing attacks. Don't provide information about your company unless you are authorized to do so. Being suspicious, so phone calls, email messages, unannounced visitors, and things like that. Never reveal personal or financial information in a plain text email. Ensuring that you're connecting to secure websites when you're logging in, so making sure that the HTTPS is there. If you're not sure about an email request, verify. So don't reply to the email, don't click on links in the email, but actually phone the person that's requesting that information. And last but not least, install and maintaining antivirus, firewalls, and email filters. And the last section is physical security. So physical security encompasses basically your work environment. So if you work in an office, it would include your office space or your desk space. If you're on the road, it would include your laptop in your car or your hotel room and things like that. Laptop security, 1 in 10 laptops will be stolen in their 3-year lifetime, which is pretty substantial. And the most common location is leaving it in the office and somebody swiping it off your desk. Some tips for when you're traveling: don't advertise that you have a laptop if you can. If you're in a hotel, drop it in the safe before you leave. Don't leave it sitting on your passenger seat of your car, even if you're just running in for a quick coffee or things like that. And if you are storing it in your car, put it in the trunk before you arrive at your location. Someone watching you stuff a laptop bag into the trunk of your car, obviously, a bad guy is going to think that's a pretty valuable target and pop your trunk open pretty quickly. Same with mobile devices, basically tiny laptops at this point. They're connected to your network. They have access to your emails, and they're easily stolen. So, being small and portable is really helpful for being able to work on the road. It's also makes them very sought after points of attack for bad guys to gain access not only to your device, but the information inside. So protecting your mobile devices, including your laptops, using strong passwords and ideally encrypting that device so that if it gets swiped out of your car, someone can't actually get access to the data because they don't have the encryption key to unlock it. Using separate business and personal devices. So if you have a USB key with Aunt Mary's 70th birthday party pictures on them, don't use those to bring to work and bring documents home. Making sure you maintain physical control of your device. So when you're going through airport security, make sure that you're paying attention to when your devices are coming out of the scanner. And again, this has been a recurring theme, making sure your antivirus software is up to date and enabling the remote wiping feature so that if you do lose your device, you're able to delete it remotely and you don't have to worry about that data getting in the hands of the bad guys. And here's the references and resources, and that concludes our information security section.
Super. So we have some questions that have come in from our attendees. So I will just, maybe I'll start with you, Kevin, since you just finished up, as there's a couple here about sending information. So one particular person is asking about sending credit card numbers via text instead of email. Is that secure?
No. Short answer, no. The technology behind text messaging is very old. It wasn't designed with security in mind. So the text can be intercepted quite easily. So I would not recommend sending credit card information via text message, or I would treat it the same as plain text email.
Which leads me to the next question, which is someone mentions that they email their banking information to customers so that they can do direct deposit. What kind of exposure would there be for that?
It depends. Like ideally, not sending that information through plain text email and using secure email channels such as ShareFile or things like that. That would be ideal. With just access to the bank account numbers, it's not, there's generally more information required in order to exploit that, right? So having just having access to the bank account numbers is not the worst thing in the world. The danger is somebody that's eavesdropping is also eavesdropping on other conversations where some of that other information may be flowing through and combined could provide access to that bank account. So that would be my caution in doing that.
Sure. And then the last one one more for security, which is someone mentioned that they use LastPass, although I will say that a couple people have asked about password managers and the protection there. So they said their laptop disk drive is encrypted, LastPass software is strong, and their passwords are written to the standards of this application, as many password managers do. So what kind of risk level are people assuming by using password managers and things like LastPass?
Yeah, like the biggest risk obviously is there being a breach of LastPass or insert random password manager software in there, right? You're trusting all of the keys to all of your systems to a third party, which, you know, there's risk involved there. You know, it would generally be really bad form for a password manager software provider to store those passwords in plain text or weak encryption or things like that. So, you know, generally they're going to have pretty high security standards as far as the practices go. So if, you know, if you have access to a ton of different systems and you have, you know, 30 different passwords that you have to remember, you know, I would rather people use password managers than recycle passwords and use the same passwords on different systems. So I would say if you're accepting the risk that all of that information is stored in a third party, then, you know, for me, I personally use LastPass. So, I mean, it's good enough for me.
Okay.
Better than my memory, that's for sure.
Okay. So this is one to probably both of you that came in earlier in the presentation, which is, how much faith do you have in payroll companies? And the question is then qualified with, lately I've noticed some deficiencies with my current provider in regards to Service Canada reporting, and even Service Canada has noticed this. So I think their question is in general, payroll companies, you know, put your faith in them, question mark?
Well, I'm pretty biased.
A little bit biased, yes. But yeah, so payroll companies as a whole, absolutely, for sure. I think all of us outsource a lot of our services. As an example, I don't cut my own hair. I get professionals to do it because otherwise it would be pretty laughable. But payroll companies, they've got the entire team set up to make sure that everybody's on track, make sure systems and programs are working the way they should be. They're investing, most of them anyway, are investing top dollar in security and making sure that data is all kept secure and private, that networks and everything are all, you know, set up against attackers and hackers. So overall, yes, absolutely. Payroll companies, obviously, again, biased, but totally a fan of them. You, just putting my governance hat on, I would say though that you should make sure that you understand where your responsibility starts, or where yours ends, sorry, and where theirs starts. And also just make sure they've got some good controls around funds management, things like that. So I mean, you know, I referenced it in my part of the presentation that payroll is in fact one of the biggest expenses for many small businesses. So make sure that they've got some really good funds management practices in place as well. Kevin, did you want to add?
Yeah, I can. I think the challenge in answering this question is we are slightly biased because we are in the industry, but the interesting thing about the payroll industry is it isn't a regulated industry. So you can have small fly-by-night organizations set up as a payroll service bureau, and unless you do the due diligence in order to make sure that they have the proper funds management, they have the SOC 1 report on internal controls that's audited by a third-party auditor. I think for me, choosing a third-party payroll provider, it comes down to doing your due diligence like you would for any other financial service, right? So there's a little bit to be said for scale. So the larger organizations are going to have the appropriate practices in place, the appropriate treasury management in place in order to make sure that the funds are handled and treated properly. They're going to have the security budget to ensure that the infrastructure is in place, and generally they're going to own their own software, right? So the larger the organization is, the more comfortable I would be. If you have a brand new payroll service bureau that just started up 6 months ago, I would probably do a little bit of extra due diligence just to make sure that you're comfortable. But as a whole, you know, for us as an industry, supporting one another and making sure that we are following best practices together is really, really important, because, you know, for our industry, making sure that we're strong and we're doing all that we can to make sure that funds are safe and data is safe is, you know, we want to make sure that the other providers are doing the same thing, so that, you know, as an entire industry, we're stronger. So I feel pretty comfortable in it.
Okay, thank you very much. So just to finish up with questions, I've seen a couple people ask what app did Kevin mention that he uses for password manager. So just to repeat, do not reuse passwords on different platforms. Someone asked if they in particular had over 25 passwords to use. Advisable, Kevin, to not repeat password use, correct?
Correct.
And if it really is impossible to remember all your passwords, things like password managers, programs,
Yeah.
LastPass is would be one of the approaches you could use.
Yeah, and then just do your research on the password manager again. So, similar to, the question around the payroll industry, finding a software vendor that has a reputation, that's been around for a few years. Do your due diligence. Has that company experienced a data breach at all? Because some of them have. So making sure that, you're doing your homework before you make the decision to download an app. Don't just download the first one that you find. And I did say that I'm using LastPass. That is what I use. That's not necessarily a paid endorsement. But I find that one to be, the most flexible for the needs that I have, and your mileage may vary.
Okay. And with that, I think we are all good for questions and presentations today. Thank you, Belinda and Kevin. And the presentation, once more, is in the handout section if you want to reference it after the webinar. Thank you very much, everyone, for attending.
Thank you.